She will leave before sunrise. Duke Draven Ashcairn spoke those words without turning from the tall windows of the grand feasting hall, where firelight from 100 candelabras reflected against the glass like trapped stars. His voice carried no anger, it carried nothing at all. Behind him, the hall overflowed with the most powerful families in the northern provinces. Roasted venison glazed with juniper, honeyed parsnips, braised quail resting on beds of wild thyme, and towers of sugared plums lined the banquet tables beneath crystal chandeliers that had burned above. Ashcairn's celebrations for 6 generations. Wine flowed generously between guests dressed in silk, fur-trimmed velvet, and jewels heavy enough to purchase entire villages. And at the center of that spectacle, standing completely alone beside the long table she had spent 3 days preparing, Revessa Ashcairn felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. The island of Thornmere, Draven continued flatly, still addressing the window rather than his wife. Sufficient distance from the estate, sufficient privacy for reflection. Thornmere, the word rippled through the hall in horrified whispers. Every noble family in the north knew Thornmere, a barren slab of storm-battered cliffs and rotting fishing huts forgotten by the crown decades earlier. Prisoners had once been sent there. Most never returned. Revessa's fingers gripped the edge of the tablecloth so tightly her knuckles whitened beneath the candlelight. Across the hall, Dowager Duchess Heldrith Ashcairn lifted her wineglass slowly, her expression perfectly composed. Beside her, Lady Lysara Vanthorpe adjusted a sapphire bracelet along her wrist without looking up, though the faintest smile touched the corner of her painted lips. Nobody spoke. Nobody defended her. Nobody even met her eyes. Revessa searched the enormous room desperately for one sympathetic face among the hundreds surrounding her. She found nothing except silence dressed in expensive clothing. Then she turned and walked toward the doors alone. But what nobody inside that glittering hall understood, not the Duke who had discarded her, not the mother who had poisoned his devotion, not the woman already measuring curtains for the chambers Revessa had slept in that very morning, was that Revessa Ashcairn would return to Greymore Hall, and when she did, the finest warriors, strategists, and leaders the kingdom had ever produced would be standing behind her. But before we continue, if you enjoy powerful emotional stories filled with betrayal, heartbreak, jealousy, and unexpected triumph, make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel. And if you truly want to support us, you can use Super Thanks below. Your support helps us continue creating these unforgettable stories for you every single day. Now, let us begin. 3 years before that devastating night inside the grand feasting hall, Revessa Hargreave arrived at the Ashcairn estate as a bride. The carriage rolled slowly through iron gates taller than oak trees, past endless lawns groomed so perfectly the grass looked painted against the hillside. Greymore Hall itself rose from the moorland like a dark cathedral carved from granite and ambition. 140 rooms, 17 fireplaces visible from the front courtyard alone, stables housing more horses than most villages held families. The Ashcairn name carried weight that made lesser noble houses speak carefully during dinner conversation, and Revessa understood, from the moment those iron gates had closed behind her carriage, that she had entered a world built entirely on control. Draven had been different during their courtship. Or perhaps she had simply wanted him to be different badly enough that she believed it. He had visited her family's modest estate in Callanshire 4 times before proposing, arriving each time with wildflowers rather than jewels, asking about her watercolor paintings rather than her dowry, and once spending an entire afternoon helping her repair a crumbling stone wall along the garden path while her father watched from the window in quiet approval. He listened then. He laughed then. He looked directly at her when she spoke, as though her words carried genuine weight inside his mind. The wedding itself was small by Ashcairn standards, though still grander than anything Callanshire had witnessed in a generation. Revessa's mother wept beside the chapel entrance. Her younger brother Stellan squeezed her hand before walking her forward, whispering that she looked braver than any soldier he had ever seen painted in books. But bravery faded quickly inside Greymore Hall. Dowager Duchess Heldrith controlled the estate with absolute precision. Every menu, every guest list, every servant's schedule, every social engagement passed through her approval before reaching anyone else. She had managed Greymore since her own husband's death 14 years earlier, and the arrival of a daughter-in-law from a lesser family visibly offended something deep within her sense of order. She never shouted. She never needed to. During Revessa's first formal dinner as Duchess, Heldrith interrupted her twice mid-sentence before turning the conversation entirely toward Draven's childhood achievements. When Revessa suggested rearranging the autumn flowers displays in the east corridor, Heldreth smiled politely and instructed the servants to keep everything exactly as it was. When Revessa requested a meeting with the household steward to understand the estate's charitable commitments to local tenant farmers, Heldreth sent word through a footman that such matters were already managed appropriately. Within 6 months, Revessa's role inside her own household had been quietly reduced to decoration, yet she refused to become decorative. Every morning before the household stirred, Revessa walked the tenant farms alone. She learned the names of every family working Ashcairn land within the first year. She asked after sick children and elderly parents. She brought leftover bread from the manor kitchens when harvests ran thin and sat beside worried mothers during difficult nights without being asked. The tenants treated her with cautious warmth at first, then with genuine affection as the months passed, because the young duchess never once behaved as though visiting them was charity. She behaved as though it was simply the right thing to do. The servants noticed the same quiet kindness inside the manor itself. Revessa thanked kitchen workers by name. She carried her own breakfast tray downstairs when the staff appeared overwhelmed during large gatherings. She remembered birthdays, mended torn aprons when seamstresses were unavailable, and once spent an entire afternoon helping the head laundress repair a broken drying rack, because no carpenter could come until the following week. Brinley, the young chambermaid assigned to Revessa's quarters, became the closest thing she had to a companion inside Greymore. The girl was barely 19, sharp-eyed and cautious after growing up watching servants dismissed for speaking too freely. But Revessa's consistent warmth slowly dissolved that caution. "You are the only person in this house who says please," Brinley admitted one morning while arranging fresh linens. The words were spoken lightly, almost as a joke, but the truth beneath them carried weight that settled painfully inside Revessa's chest. Meanwhile, Draven changed. The transformation happened so gradually that Revessa spent months questioning whether she was imagining it. Conversations between them shortened. Evenings he once spent reading beside her in the library became evenings spent inside his study with the door closed. He stopped asking about her paintings. He stopped noticing when she entered rooms. The man who had once helped her repair a garden wall now passed her in corridors without breaking stride, his eyes fixed on documents or distant thoughts she was no longer invited to share. Revessa tried. She left books he might enjoy on his desk. She arranged his favorite supper, roasted partridge with blackcurrant sauce. On evenings she suspected he had returned from difficult meetings. She once waited in the library until nearly midnight hoping he would appear, only to learn from Brinley the following morning that he had retired early to his study and asked not to be disturbed by anyone. The word anyone struck with particular cruelty, as though his wife had become just another member of the household staff whose presence required management rather than welcome. Heldreth hosted increasingly elaborate gatherings at Greymore, filling the estate with families whose daughters laughed too brightly whenever Draven spoke. Among them, Lady Lysara Vanthorpe appeared with growing frequency. She was beautiful in the way expensive things are beautiful, polished and deliberate, and designed to attract attention from specific angles. Her voice carried practiced warmth that charmed everyone except those paying careful attention. Revessa paid careful attention. She noticed how Lysara's hand lingered slightly too long against Draven's arm during introductions. She noticed how Heldreth personally ensured Lysara was seated beside Draven at every dinner. She noticed how conversations between Draven and Lysara continued privately in the drawing room long after other guests had departed. And she noticed how the household staff exchanged uncomfortable glances whenever Lysara's carriage appeared at the front gates, because servants always understand the architecture of a household's collapse before anyone living in its upper rooms. One evening, while carrying a stack of mended table linens past the partially open door of Heldreth's private sitting room, Revessa heard words that stopped her breathing entirely. The Hargreave girl was always temporary, Heldreth said calmly. Draven required a wife quickly after the scandal with the Pemberton affair. Her family was available and appropriately desperate. But Lysara brings genuine value, political connections, considerable fortune, and far more appropriate breeding. Revessa stood frozen in the dim corridor. The linens pressed against her chest felt suddenly heavier than stone. Then Heldreth's voice continued, quieter now, carrying the cold precision of someone who had already decided an outcome and was simply waiting for the world to cooperate. The marriage must be dissolved, quietly, permanently, and Revessa must have no grounds to contest it. The linens trembled in Revessa's arms. She forced herself to continue walking before anyone discovered her listening. That night, she sat alone beside her bedroom window while rain streaked silently against the glass, and for the first time since arriving at Graymore Hall, she understood with terrible clarity that she had never been a wife inside this house. She had been a placeholder. The Ashcairn Midsummer Banquet had been Heldreth's invention 3 decades earlier, designed as an annual display of family power draped in the appearance of celebration. Every important family within 200 miles received invitations engraved on ivory cardstock sealed with the Ashcairn crest in black wax. Refusal was considered an insult. Attendance was considered submission. That year's banquet carried particular electricity. Whispers had already spread through noble drawing rooms across the northern counties that Lady Lysara Vanthorpe had become a permanent fixture at Graymore Hall. Nobody spoke about it directly during polite conversation, but the implication hung over every interaction like smoke above a fire nobody acknowledged. Revessa spent 11 days preparing the event. She coordinated deliveries of wine from 3 separate merchants after the original supplier failed. She resolved a dispute between the head cook and the pastry chef that nearly collapsed the entire dessert menu 4 days before the banquet. She personally inspected 60 guest chambers, ensuring fresh flowers, clean linens, and properly stocked wash basins in each room. She managed seating arrangements for over 200 guests, carefully navigating political tensions between families who despised each other but expected to be placed near the head table. Heldreth supervised none of it. Heldreth simply expected perfection and assigned consequences for anything less. On the morning of the banquet, Revessa stood inside the grand kitchen at 5:30, helping Brinley carry crates of crystal glasses from the cellar because 2 footmen had fallen ill during the night. Her arms ached. Her lower back throbbed from bending over polishing cloths for hours. A shallow cut across her left palm, earned while trimming rose stems the previous afternoon, reopened and bled lightly into the cloth she had wrapped around her hand. By the time evening arrived and the first carriages rolled through the Graymore gates, Revessa had been working for nearly 14 hours without sitting down. The feasting hall looked magnificent. Golden candelabras lined the walls between towering arrangements of white lilies and deep violet irises. Long tables draped in ivory linen held silver platters of roasted lamb carved tableside, glazed root vegetables swimming in rosemary butter, whole-baked salmon dressed with lemon and dill, warm bread rolls dusted with sea salt, and chilled oysters resting on beds of crushed ice delivered that morning from the coast. Enormous crystal bowls of wine punch anchored each table corner, while servants moved between guests carrying trays of champagne in glasses so thin, the light passed through them like water. Nobody mentioned Revessa's name once during the preparations. When compliments arrived, they traveled directly to Heldreth. "Exquisite as always, Duchess," murmured the Countess of Barrowmere, while admiring the flower arrangements Revessa had personally designed and assembled. Heldreth accepted the praise with a gracious nod. Standards matter greatly in a household like ours. Revessa stood near the musicians carrying a tray of champagne glasses she had offered to distribute after noticing the serving staff struggling to keep pace with the crowd. Her gown was the plainest in the room, a dark gray silk she had worn to 3 previous gatherings because no new clothing had been provided for her since the previous autumn. Beside the jewel-covered gown surrounding her, she resembled a shadow more than a duchess. Then Lysara arrived. The hall shifted the moment she appeared at the entrance. She wore ivory satin embroidered with gold thread that caught every candle flame in the room. Diamonds rested against her collarbone like captured starlight. Her dark hair was arranged with pearl-tipped pins that must have taken a lady's maid over 2 hours to place. She looked, by careful and expensive design, like a woman arriving to claim a throne. Heldreth crossed the hall personally to greet her, something she had not done for any other guest that evening, including families of significantly higher rank. Draven followed his mother. Revessa watched from beside the musicians as her husband offered Lysara his arm and escorted her toward the head table, past dozens of guests who tracked the gesture with knowing expressions. He had not spoken to Revessa once since the banquet began. He had not looked at her since breakfast, and even then his eyes had passed over her the way they passed over wallpaper. During supper, Heldreth raised her glass and addressed the room with the practiced command of a woman accustomed to obedience. The Ashcairn family has always valued loyalty, excellence, and the strength of lasting alliances. Tonight I wish to acknowledge someone whose friendship has brought immeasurable warmth to this household over the past year. To Lady Lysara Vanthorpe, a woman of extraordinary grace, Crystal glasses lifted throughout the hall. Applause rippled politely between the tables. Lysara lowered her eyes with rehearsed modesty while Draven watched her with an expression Revessa recognized instantly because it once belonged to. Her admiration, genuine admiration, directed at another woman while his wife stood 15 feet away holding a champagne tray. Coruscante, Draven's younger sister, leaned toward Lysara with a bright smile after the toast settled. Honestly, you belong at this table permanently. Coruscante glanced sideways toward Revessa with barely disguised contempt. Some people simply occupy chairs meant for others without realizing it. Soft laughter traveled across the table. Lysara pressed her fingers lightly against Draven's sleeve and smiled warmly without correcting anything. Revessa placed the champagne tray carefully onto the nearest side table before her trembling hands betrayed her completely. She walked steadily through the hall, past the musicians, past the servants, past the enormous doors, and continued walking until cold night air struck her face in the darkened garden. She pressed both hands flat against the stone wall beside the kitchen entrance and breathed in shallow, shaking gasps while tears carved warm lines down her cold cheeks. Several minutes passed before she heard footsteps behind her. Brinley appeared carrying a wool shawl and draped it gently across Revessa's shoulders without asking permission. "You built everything beautiful inside that room tonight," Brinley said quietly. "Every flower, every glass, every candle. And not one person said your name." Revessa closed her eyes tightly. "Perhaps they are right," she whispered. "Perhaps I'm simply occupying a chair meant for someone else." Brinley stepped closer, her voice carrying an edge of quiet fury that Revessa had never heard from her before. "No, they are cruel. And cruelty dressed in diamonds is still cruelty." The words hung between them in the cold garden air while music and laughter drifted faintly through. The windows above celebrating a woman being slowly erased from her own life, and inside the hall, behind the laughter and the champagne and the ivory satin, something far worse was already being planned. Before Heldrith poisoned everything, there had been a season when Revessa Ashcairn believed she was genuinely loved. During the first autumn after the wedding, Greymore Hall softened beneath golden light that filtered through the enormous windows facing the western moors. Draven spent mornings beside Revessa in the estate library, reading aloud from histories of ancient naval campaigns while she sketched landscapes in charcoal on thick parchment paper. He brought her wild heather from the hillside during afternoon walks and placed the stems awkwardly into a chipped ceramic vase she kept beside the bedroom window because it reminded her of home. At night they sat together near the upstairs fireplace while wind howled across the moorland outside, and Draven spoke about his father. He was a hard man, Draven admitted quietly one evening while staring into the flames. He believed softness was failure. That strength only existed inside discipline and control. Revessa reached for his hand carefully. "You are not your father." Draven looked at her then with an expression she never forgot, because it contained something she never saw again afterward. Vulnerability, genuine, unguarded vulnerability offered without calculation. For those few months, Revessa believed she had found the real man beneath the title. And during that same autumn, she discovered something about herself that surprised everyone inside Greymore Hall. Devastating floods struck the lower valley after weeks of relentless October rain. Rivers broke their banks across tenant farmland, destroying crops, drowning livestock, and forcing families from homes that had stood for generations. The estate steward, an elderly man named Fenwick, became overwhelmed within days. Supply chains collapsed, relief wagons arrived at the wrong locations. Displaced families waited in freezing barns without blankets or clean water, while administrative confusion spread through every level of the household response. Revessa stepped forward without asking permission. Within 2 days, she had reorganized the entire relief effort. She mapped every affected farm using information gathered personally from tenant families she had already befriended during her morning walks. She redirected supply wagons along routes that avoided flooded roads. She established a temporary shelter inside the estate's unused eastern stables, personally overseeing the delivery of bedding, firewood, medical supplies, and hot meals prepared by kitchen staff she had quietly convinced to work additional hours by volunteering alongside them herself. She slept no more than 3 hours each night during the crisis, moving between the temporary shelter and the affected farms on horseback through mud that reached her stirrups. One morning she arrived at the Braden farm to find the family's grandmother, Cordell, standing in ankle-deep water trying to rescue jars of preserved vegetables from a flooding cellar. Revessa climbed down into the cellar beside her without hesitation and carried 17 jars up the slippery stone steps while cold water soaked through her dress to the skin. Fenwick watched in astonishment as the young Duchess coordinated efforts with a calm authority that seasoned military quartermasters would have envied. He later told the kitchen staff, in a rare moment of candor, that he had managed 3 previous estate emergencies under the old Duke, and none had been handled with half the competence the young Duchess had demonstrated in her first. 14 families were housed safely within 3 days. Not a single life was lost across Ashcairn land, though neighboring estates suffered terribly. Tenant farmers spoke about Revessa with something approaching reverence for months afterward. Old Cordell, a weathered grandmother from the Braden farm whose grandchild Revessa had nursed through fever just weeks before the floods arrived, told anyone willing to listen that the young Duchess possessed more natural leadership than any lord she had served beneath in 60 years of working. "Ashcairn soil, you came for my grandchild when she was burning with fever?" Cordell said one afternoon while Revessa helped distribute dry blankets among families returning to their repaired homes. "And now you come for all of us. Nobody from the great house has ever done that. Not once in all my years." Revessa squeezed the old woman's rough hands gently. "I will always come, Cordell." For one brief week, Revessa felt she had found her purpose. She had been useful, capable, and visible in a way that mattered. Then Heldreth ended it. The confrontation happened inside the Dowager Duchess's private sitting room, 3 days after the floodwaters receded. Revessa was not invited to speak. She was summoned to listen. "Your behavior during the flooding was inappropriate," Heldreth stated calmly while pouring tea into porcelain cups painted with the Ashcairn family crest. "A duchess does not personally carry blankets into stables. She does not kneel in mud beside farm workers. She does not command household staff as though she holds military rank." Revessa's hands tightened in her lap. 14 families were saved. Heldreth set the teapot down without hurry. "That is precisely the problem. You have given tenant farmers the impression that the Duchess of Ashcairn answers to them. You have undermined the proper order of authority inside this estate. And you have embarrassed this family by behaving as though noble women should perform the work of stewards and servants." Revessa stared at the older woman in disbelief. "People could have died. People survive or they do not. That is God's business. Maintaining the dignity of this household is ours." That evening, Draven entered their bedroom while Revessa sat motionless beside the window, still wearing the same dress from that morning. She expected him to reassure her. She expected the man who had once held her hand beside the fireplace and admitted vulnerability to recognize the injustice in his mother's words. Instead, he stood near the doorway with his arms crossed and spoke in a voice that had already been shaped by a conversation with Heldreth hours earlier. "My mother is correct, Revessa. You overstepped your position. The estate steward manages emergencies. You manage appearances. Please do not confuse the two again." Something cracked inside Revessa that night, not loudly, not dramatically. It cracked the way foundations crack, invisibly, beneath the surface, where nobody notices until the entire structure begins to lean. She stopped walking the tenant farms alone. She stopped offering suggestions during household meetings. She stopped sketching landscapes beside the library windows. The watercolor supplies Draven had once admired gathered dust inside a drawer she no longer opened. The woman who had coordinated the rescue of 14 families in 3 days slowly became the woman who carried champagne trays silently through feasting halls while louder voices filled the spaces she once occupied. And Draven never once asked why she had changed. The following spring brought a development that removed any remaining doubt about Revessa's position inside Greymore Hall. Heldreth announced during a private family dinner that Lady Lysara Vanthorpe would serve as the official hostess for the Ashcairn Spring Levee, the most prestigious social gathering on the northern calendar. The role had belonged to the reigning Duchess of Ashcairn for over a century. Revessa's predecessor, Draven's grandmother, had held the title with legendary elegance. Every powerful family in the region understood exactly what the announcement meant. Coruscant delivered the news to Revessa personally, entering her chambers the following morning with an expression balanced carefully between false sympathy and satisfaction. "Mother felt it would ease the burden on you," Coruscant explained while examining her own reflection in Revessa's vanity mirror. "Lysara is so wonderfully skilled with large social events. You must be relieved, honestly." Revessa folded a linen napkin slowly in her lap, pressing the creases flat with deliberate care. "Of course." Coruscant paused near the doorway on her way out. "I do hope you will still attend. Naturally, perhaps assisting with the floral arrangements. You have always been talented with flowers." The door closed behind her with a soft click that felt louder than a slap. The spring levee arrived on a cloudless April evening. 300 guests filled the estate's gardens and public rooms, where lanterns hung from every tree and candles burned inside colored glass along the stone pathways. Lysara presided over the event, wearing a gown of pale rose silk that Heldrith had personally commissioned from a London dressmaker. She greeted arriving families by name, guided conversations between political rivals with practiced ease, and charmed elderly noblemen with precisely measured laughter that carried warmth without impropriety. Servants moved obediently around her, though none smiled the way they once had when Revessa managed gatherings. Obedience performed under fear carries a different posture than service offered under respect, and anyone paying attention could see the difference in the stiffened shoulders and lowered eyes of every maid who passed within earshot of Lysara's voice. Revessa stood near the west corridor, arranging centerpieces nobody had asked her to arrange. Wearing a gown she had mended herself the previous week, because no seamstress appointments had been scheduled for her. 2 guests passed her without recognition. A third mistook her for a servant and asked her to fetch wine. A fourth, an elderly baroness who had attended Revessa's wedding 3 years earlier, looked directly at her with an expression of confused pity before being guided away by Corisande toward the head table. She fetched the wine without correcting the mistake. Then she stood beside the corridor wall and watched the celebration she should have been leading unfold around a woman who had replaced her as effortlessly as changing a tablecloth. Yet something unexpected happened that evening. During the third course of supper, Revessa noticed Lysara snap sharply at a young serving girl who had accidentally placed a water glass on the wrong side of a place setting. The girl flinched visibly, and her hand trembled as she corrected the glass beneath Lysara's cold stare. Lysara's composure returned instantly, her smile reappearing like a mask sliding back into position. But several guests nearby exchanged brief glances that lingered slightly longer than comfortable. Later, near the dessert service, Revessa overheard Lysara dismiss a kitchen worker's concern about running low on cream by snapping that incompetence was not her problem to manage. The worker retreated with reddened eyes. Heldrith, standing nearby, said nothing. The cracks were small, almost invisible. But Revessa saw them clearly because she understood something about Lysara that everyone else was still too dazzled to notice. Kindness performed only when observed is not kindness. It is currency, and currencies eventually lose their value. The conspiracy that sent Revessa to Thornmere did not arrive suddenly. It had been assembled carefully across months, the way a hunter builds a trap long before the animal approaches. Revessa discovered the first piece by accident. While searching for misplaced household ledgers inside Heldrith's study one October afternoon, she found a letter partially concealed beneath a stack of correspondence. The handwriting belonged to Lord Morkiel Ventris, a parliamentary solicitor with a reputation for dissolving noble marriages discreetly when sufficient money changed hands. The letter referenced grounds for formal separation based on failure to produce an heir within 5 years of marriage. Legal precedents were cited. Financial arrangements were outlined. A suggested timeline was proposed, ending with a single sentence that burned itself permanently into Revessa's memory. The Thornmere property remains available for long-term residency and offers the advantage of considerable distance from public scrutiny. Revessa's hands trembled so violently the letter nearly slipped from her fingers. They had been planning this for months, possibly longer. The exile was not a sudden decision born from anger or disappointment. It was an engineered outcome designed by people who had decided her fate before she ever understood the game she had been placed inside. She returned the letter exactly where she found it and walked calmly from the study, though her heartbeat hammered so loudly inside her ears that she could barely hear the footsteps of servants passing through the corridor. That evening she told Brinley everything. The young chambermaid listened without interrupting, her face cycling through shock, fury, and finally a quiet resolve that made her look years older than 19. "You must tell the Duke," Brinley insisted. "Surely he would not allow this if he understood what his mother has arranged." Revessa shook her head slowly. "He already knows, Brinley. He has always known." The silence between them lasted nearly a full minute. Over the following weeks, the trap tightened. Heldrith began hosting private conversations with influential families, carefully seeding the narrative that Revessa had become emotionally unstable, withdrawn, and incapable of fulfilling her duties as Duchess. She described Revessa's behavior during the floods as evidence of erratic judgment. rather than leadership, reframing the rescue effort as a humiliating spectacle that had damaged the family's dignity beyond repair. Corisande reinforced the story during ladies' luncheons, sighing sympathetically about her sister-in-law's fragile constitution while guests nodded, with rehearsed concern. Even the local vicar received a carefully worded visit from Heldreth, suggesting that prayers for the young duchess's troubled mind might be appropriate during Sunday services. Lysara contributed by contrast alone. Every public appearance she made beside Draven reinforced the unspoken argument that the Duke already had a more suitable partner waiting to replace. His current wife, she attended charity functions on his arm. She accompanied him to political dinners. She sat beside him at church services while Revessa occupied a pew 3 rows behind, watching the back of her husband's head beside a woman slowly stealing her entire existence. The final strike came during the November frost. Heldreth summoned Revessa to the formal drawing room, where Draven sat behind his father's mahogany desk with documents already prepared. Lysara was not present, though her perfume lingered faintly in the upholstery. Corisande stood beside the fireplace with her arms folded. Lord Morcael Ventris sat in the corner holding a leather case filled with legal papers. Revessa entered and understood everything immediately. Draven did not look at her while he spoke. His voice carried the rehearsed flatness of a man reciting words someone else had written for him. The marriage has not produced an heir. Your behavior has raised concerns regarding your fitness as Duchess. It has been decided that a period of extended separation would serve the interests of the family and the estate. Revessa stood perfectly still. Every instinct inside her body screamed to argue, to fight, to demand recognition for every meal she had organized, every servant she had protected, every tenant family she had cared for, every invisible hour of labor she had poured into a household that treated her like furniture. Instead, she asked one question: "Did you ever love me, Draven? Or was I always meant to be temporary?" The silence that followed was the loudest sound Revessa had ever heard inside Greymore Hall. Draven's jaw tightened. His eyes remained fixed on the documents. He never answered. Heldreth spoke instead. "Arrangements for Thornmere have been finalized. A carriage will collect you before sunrise. You may bring one trunk, an entire life inside one trunk." Revessa turned and walked from the room without tears. She had spent 3 years crying inside this house. She refused to give them the satisfaction of watching it happen one final time. That night, Brinley helped her pack in silence. The chambermaid's hands shook with barely contained anger as she folded dresses into the single trunk permitted by the family that had already erased Revessa from every future conversation. As the final clasp closed, Brinley suddenly gripped Revessa's wrist. "Let me come with you." Revessa stared at her. "Thornmere is nothing, Brinley. An empty rock in the middle of the sea." Brinley's eyes glistened in the candlelight, but her voice carried a quiet certainty that Revessa had never heard from her before. "There is you, that is enough." Hours later, the grand feasting hall blazed with candlelight as Heldreth hosted the evening banquet that had been planned for weeks. 200 guests filled the tables. Silver trays carried roasted venison and sugared plums, and before that glittering audience, Draven Ashcairn announced his wife's departure to Thornmere with the same flat voice he had used inside the drawing room, as though discarding a human being required no more emotion than reading from a shipping ledger. Revessa was not present to hear it. She was already upstairs, sitting beside a packed trunk in a darkened bedroom, waiting for a carriage that would arrive before dawn. Before first light painted the moors gray, that carriage rolled through the iron gates of Greymore Hall, carrying 2 women and 1 trunk toward a forgotten island that the rest of the kingdom had abandoned decades earlier. Behind them, every window of the great house remained dark. Nobody watched them leave. Nobody waved. Nobody stood in the cold morning air to acknowledge that the woman who had once saved 14 families from floodwater was being discarded like furniture deemed too unfashionable to keep. But the sea surrounding Thornmere was not empty, and the people living on that desolate, salt-scored rock had been waiting for someone exactly like Revessa for a very long time. Thornmere revealed itself through fog on the 3rd morning at sea. The island emerged slowly from gray water like the spine of something ancient, breaking the surface. Black cliffs rose sharply from waves that crashed with enough force to send white spray 40 feet into the air. Beyond the cliffs, treeless hillsides, covered in gorse and wind-flattened scrub, stretched toward a sky so low and heavy it seemed to press the entire island downward into the ocean. The fishing boat carrying Revessa and Brinley scraped against a rotting wooden dock that groaned beneath their weight as they stepped ashore. Wind struck immediately, so fierce and constant that Revessa had to press one hand against her chest to keep her coat from tearing open. The carriage driver who had delivered them to the coastal port 2 days earlier had refused to speak about Thornmere. The fisherman who agreed to transport them across the channel had charged triple his usual fare and would not make eye contact during the crossing. When they landed, he pushed away from the dock before Revessa had even lifted her trunk onto the weathered planks. The village, if the word still applied, sat in a shallow valley behind the cliffs. Perhaps 40 structures remained standing, most built from rough gray stone with roofs patched unevenly using driftwood, old sailcloth, and whatever materials the sea had offered over the years. Smoke rose thinly from a handful of chimneys. A single unpaved road connected the village to the dock, its surface churned into cold mud by rain and boot traffic. Brinley stared at the scene without speaking for nearly a full minute. Then she picked up one end of the trunk and nodded forward. The first person they encountered was an old woman named Marith, carrying a bucket of rainwater from a collection barrel near the village edge. She stopped walking when she saw them and studied Revessa with sharp, suspicious eyes buried inside a face weathered by decades of salt wind. "You are the one they sent from the mainland," Marith said flatly. It was not a question. Revessa nodded. "I am Revessa Ashcairn." Marith's expression did not change. "We had a lord once, too. He drank himself blind within a year and died choking on fish bones." She shifted the water bucket to her other hand. "Welcome to Thornmere. That first week nearly broke her. The island held roughly 200 souls. Some were descendants of prisoners exiled generations earlier for debts or minor political offenses. Others were military veterans abandoned after campaigns the Crown preferred to forget, men who had served faithfully and returned home to discover their pensions revoked and their names erased from regimental records. Skilled tradespeople who had fallen from favor, families displaced by industrial enclosure of common lands, fishermen whose coastal villages had been seized by noble estates expanding their territory. Every person on Thornmere carried a story of being discarded by the same society that had discarded Revessa, and they had learned to trust no one from the mainland. Revessa's title meant nothing here. Her name carried no authority. The islanders watched her with the guarded caution of people who had been promised things before and received nothing except silence. She understood that caution because she had lived inside it for 3 years at Graymore Hall. So she did what she had always done when words carried no weight. She worked. On the 4th morning, Revessa walked to the village's crumbling storage building and spent 9 hours alongside Brinley and 2 skeptical fishermen repairing the damaged roof before winter storms made the structure useless. Her hands bled through the cloth wrappings by midday. She did not stop. By afternoon, a 3rd fisherman appeared without being asked and began handing up materials from below. By evening, a 4th arrived carrying tools. Nobody spoke about why they had come. The work itself was the conversation. On the 6th day, she identified that the village's fresh water supply, a shallow well near the eastern hillside, had been slowly contaminated by runoff from a collapsed drainage channel. She organized a work crew to redirect the channel using techniques she had learned from tenant farmers on Ashcairn land during the flood relief. Effort, the same effort Heldreth had punished her for, and Draven had dismissed as overstepping. The irony was not lost on her. The skills that had been called inappropriate inside a grand estate were now the only things keeping 200 people alive on a forgotten island. Clean water flowed by the end of the week. Marith watched from her doorway without comment. But the following morning she left a parcel of dried fish outside Revessa's door. It was the first offering of trust on the island, and Revessa never forgot it. Small gestures followed after that, offered cautiously the way wild animals approach an unfamiliar hand. A farmer named Torben began sharing information about the island's soil conditions and which hillsides sheltered crops most effectively from ocean wind. A former naval officer named Hadwin, who had served 20 years before being discharged without pension after refusing to falsify supply. Records for a corrupt admiral started appearing near Revessa during planning discussions, offering tactical observations in a voice roughened by years of disuse. Brinley noticed the change before Revessa did. "They listen to you," the chambermaid said one evening while mending a torn fishing net beside the fireplace of the small stone cottage they shared. "Not because you demand it, because you earned it." Revessa stared into the fire without responding. Something long buried was stirring inside her chest, something that 3 years of diminishment at Graymore Hall had nearly suffocated entirely. Purpose. Then, during the 3rd week, while exploring the island's northern coastline with Hadwin, Revessa discovered something that changed everything. Hidden behind a wall of collapsed rock, battered by centuries of waves but still structurally intact, stood the remains of a deep-water harbor. Stone breakwaters extended into the channel like massive arms embracing a natural anchorage large enough to shelter a dozen warships. Beside the harbor, carved into the cliff face itself, sat the ruins of a military fortification complete with barracks, a forge, storage vaults, and defensive walls that had once commanded an unobstructed view of every northern shipping lane entering the kingdom. Hadwin ran his hand across the ancient stonework with something approaching reverence. "This was a Crown naval station," he said quietly. "Possibly 2 centuries old, abandoned when the Admiralty shifted operations south." He turned toward Revessa with an expression she had never seen from anyone on Thornmere before. "Whoever controls this harbor controls the northern coast." Revessa stared at the fortification while wind howled through the ruined walls and waves crashed against the breakwater below. And somewhere deep inside the exhaustion and grief and years of silence, the woman who had once organized the rescue of 14 farming families began to understand exactly what she was going to build. Revessa did not build an army. She built a community that an army grew out of naturally. The transformation of Thornmere took 22 months, though afterward, islanders who lived through it often said the change felt both impossibly fast and as though it had always been inevitable, as though the island had simply been waiting for permission to become what it was always meant to be. The harbor reconstruction began first. Hadwin organized former military veterans into engineering crews that cleared rubble, reinforced breakwaters, and rebuilt the ancient docking structures using timber salvaged from shipwrecks along the eastern shore. Revessa personally negotiated the first trade agreement with a merchant captain named Sorrel, who ran supply routes between the mainland and the northern fishing islands. The negotiation lasted 4 hours inside a freezing stone building with no furniture except 2 overturned crates. Sorrel left with exclusive docking rights at Thornmere's harbor. Revessa left with monthly deliveries of iron, rope, grain, and building tools. Within 6 months, the harbor was operational. Within 9, 3 additional merchant vessels had added Thornmere to their regular routes after. Hearing that the island offered safe anchorage, fair trading terms, and a harbor master, Hadwin, who ran operations with the precision of the naval officer he had never stopped being, despite the Crown's attempts to erase him. The fortification came next. Revessa and Hadwin walked every inch of the ancient military complex together during that first winter, documenting what could be restored and what needed rebuilding entirely. Former soldiers who had spent years fishing and repairing rooftops found themselves remembering skills they thought had rusted beyond recovery. Stonemasons among the exiled tradespeople shaped new blocks to replace crumbled walls. A blacksmith named Gavrin, exiled 15 years earlier for publicly defending a servant boy against a cruel nobleman, rebuilt the forge and began producing tools, nails, hinges, and eventually blades with a craftsmanship that drew admiring comments from every merchant captain who visited. Revessa organized training rotations for every able-bodied islander willing to participate. Hadwin designed the program using modified naval discipline adapted for people who had spent years distrusting authority. The training was voluntary. Nobody was forced, threatened, or punished. People joined because they believed in what was being built, and they believed because Revessa had earned that belief one repaired roof, one clean well, one remembered name at a time. By the end of the 2nd year, Thornmere's militia numbered over 100 trained men and women. They were not parade soldiers polished for royal inspection. They were fishermen who could navigate treacherous coastal waters blindfolded. Farmers who understood terrain and weather with instinctive precision. Tradespeople who could repair fortifications, forge weapons, and construct defenses from whatever materials the island provided. Veterans who carried decades of genuine combat experience that no academy could replicate. The kingdom's forgotten had become the kingdom's finest, and nobody on the mainland had any idea. Meanwhile, across the channel, Greymore Hall was quietly rotting from the inside. Lysara Vanthorpe had achieved everything she designed. Within months of Revessa's exile, she had installed herself at Draven's side with the practiced ease of someone stepping into a role she had been rehearsing for years. Heldreth publicly endorsed the arrangement. Coruscant embraced Lysara as the sister she had always wanted. Society adjusted its attention accordingly, because society always adjusts toward power regardless of how that power was obtained. But running a great household required more than charm performed at dinner tables. Tenant farmers who had once trusted Revessa began receiving curt dismissals when they brought concerns to the estate. Servants who had grown accustomed to kindness encountered coldness that hardened into fear. Lysara had no interest in managing supply chains, resolving disputes between kitchen staff, or inspecting guest chambers before gatherings. She had interest only in being seen, admired, and envied. The invisible machinery that Revessa had maintained through exhausting daily effort began grinding to a halt. Crop yields fell after 2 consecutive seasons of neglected drainage maintenance on tenant farmland. 3 experienced servants resigned quietly after Lysara berated them publicly during a dinner gathering for minor errors that Revessa would have corrected privately with gentle words. Fenwick, the elderly steward, requested retirement after Lysara overruled his supply budget to fund an extravagant redecorating project that left the estate short on winter provisions. Draven noticed none of it. Or perhaps he noticed and lacked the capacity to address problems he had never been required to understand, because Revessa had always handled them so quietly that he assumed they resolved themselves. Then the northern raids began. Coastal villages along the kingdom's northern shore reported attacks from foreign vessels during the autumn storms. Fishing boats were seized. Warehouses were burned. 3 villages were raided within a single month, each attack bolder than the last. The Crown dispatched naval patrols, but the northern coastline stretched across hundreds of miles of inlets and hidden coves that mainland commanders barely understood. Panic spread through the northern counties. Noble families demanded protection. Trade routes were disrupted. Insurance costs for merchant vessels tripled overnight. The economy of the entire northern region, including the Ashcairn estates, began hemorrhaging money at a rate that even Draven could not ignore. An emergency summons arrived from the Crown requesting any available military resources, trained personnel, or strategic assets that northern estate holders could contribute to the coastal defense effort. Draven had nothing to offer. His estate had maintained no military capability for decades. His influence in Parliament, already weakened by 2 years of declining revenues and tenant disputes, carried insufficient weight to demand Crown resources be redirected toward protecting Ashcairn interests specifically. The summons also reached Thornmere. Revessa read the Crown's letter inside the restored command room of the island's fortification while wind rattled. The windows and rain streaked across glass that Gavrin's workshop had cut and fitted only 3 months earlier. Hadwin stood beside her, arms folded, his weathered face unreadable. "The kingdom that threw us away now asks for our help," he said quietly. Revessa set the letter down carefully on the oak table she had built with her own hands during the first winter. "They are not asking us, Hadwin. They are asking anyone. They do not even know we exist." She stood and walked toward the window overlooking the harbor, where 6 vessels now rested at anchor and lantern light glowed warmly from buildings that had been ruins 2 years earlier. Behind her, Brinley entered carrying a tray of hot tea and salted bread. The chambermaid had become Thornmere's head of household operations, managing supplies, coordinating work schedules, and organizing community meals with the same quiet efficiency that had once made her the only bearable presence inside. Greymore Hall. Brinley set the tray down and looked at Revessa's face for a long moment. "You have already decided," she said simply. Revessa turned from the window. Her expression carried something that neither Brinley nor Hadwin had ever seen from her before. Not sadness. Not determination, something fiercer. "They sent me here to disappear." She paused. "I intend to arrive." The flotilla appeared through morning fog on the 23rd of November, moving in disciplined formation across the gray channel waters toward the mainland harbor at Dunhallow. 6 vessels flying the Thornmere standard, a silver anchor crossed with a single thorn branch against a dark blue field, a crest Revessa had designed herself during a late evening beside Hadwin's charts. The ships were not warships in any traditional sense. They were reinforced merchant vessels and rebuilt fishing boats, practical and weathered, crewed by people who understood northern waters better than any Naval Academy graduate alive. But the 130 people standing on those decks carried themselves with unmistakable discipline. Former soldiers in restored armor stood beside fishermen carrying longbows carved from Thornmere driftwood. Tradespeople carried tools and building supplies for rapid fortification construction. Hadwin commanded the lead vessel wearing a naval officer's coat he had kept folded inside a trunk for 15 years, waiting without knowing what he was waiting for, and at the bow of the flagship, standing motionless against the wind with her dark hair pulled back beneath a simple iron circlet forged by Gavrin, stood Revessa Ashcairn. She looked nothing like the woman who had been carried away from Greymore in a single carriage with one trunk and a trembling chambermaid. The softness had not disappeared. The gentleness remained in her eyes, in the way she spoke to her crew, in the way she remembered every name aboard every vessel. But something had been added to those qualities: authority. The kind of authority that is never seized or inherited, but earned through labor witnessed by the people granting it. Word of the flotilla's arrival reached Graymore Hall before Revessa's boots touched the Dunhallow dock. Corisande brought the news to Heldreth's private sitting room, nearly dropping a teacup in her haste. A fleet from Thornmere. They say a woman to commands it. Heldreth's expression did not change, but the color drained from her face with a speed that betrayed the composure she had spent a lifetime perfecting. That is not possible. Within hours, the Northern Counties military coordinator, a Crown-appointed colonel named Ashworth, arrived at Dunhallow to assess the unexpected reinforcement. He had expected, at best, a handful of untrained fishermen volunteering out of desperation. What he found rendered him temporarily speechless. Hadwin presented the Thornmere force's capabilities with the crisp efficiency of a man who had spent 20 years following military protocol and 2 years rebuilding it from memory, trained infantry, coastal navigation expertise covering every inlet, cove, and hidden channel along the northern shore, a fortified harbor capable of serving as a forward operating base for the entire defense campaign, engineering crews capable of constructing rapid shore defenses, a blacksmith producing weapons of exceptional quality. Colonel Ashworth turned toward Revessa with an expression balanced between astonishment and cautious respect. "You built all of this on Thornmere? The island we decommissioned 30 years ago?" Revessa met his eyes calmly. "The island you abandoned 30 years ago. The distinction matters." Colonel Ashworth studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Madam, I believe it does." The Emergency Defense Council convened 3 days later inside the Great Hall of Dunhallow Castle. Attended by every noble estate holder in the northern counties, Draven Ashcairn was required to attend. He entered the hall wearing a dark coat that appeared freshly tailored, though the tension visible across his jaw and the shadows beneath his eyes suggested a man who had not slept properly in days. Beside him walked Lasara, dressed in pale blue silk that looked absurdly delicate inside a military planning environment. Heldreth followed, leaning on Corisande's arm, her posture rigid with the particular stiffness of someone refusing to acknowledge discomfort. Revessa was already seated at the council table when they arrived. The silence that erupted when Draven saw his wife lasted long enough for every person in the hall to feel it. Lasara's composure fractured visibly. Her fingers tightened around Draven's arm before releasing quickly, as though she had touched something dangerously hot. Heldreth stopped walking entirely for 3 full seconds before Corisande guided her forward. With a gentle pressure against her elbow, Revessa did not stand, she did not flinch. She did not lower her eyes or adjust her posture or perform any version of the shrinking deference that Graymore Hall had trained into her across 3 years of systematic diminishment. She simply looked at Draven with steady, calm eyes and waited. Colonel Ashworth opened the council proceedings by introducing the Thornmere contingent as the most strategically significant contribution to the northern defense effort received from any source. He outlined their capabilities, their harbor infrastructure, and their commander's organizational achievements in terms that made several estate holders glance toward Revessa with open surprise. Then Ashworth asked Revessa to present her proposed defense strategy for the northern coastline. She stood and spoke for nearly 20 minutes. Her voice carried clearly through the stone hall without shouting. She referenced tidal patterns, seasonal storm windows, enemy vessel capabilities observed during 2 previous raids witnessed from Thornmere's watchtowers, and specific geographic vulnerabilities along the coast that mainland commanders had overlooked because they had never spent enough time in northern waters to understand them. When she finished, the hall remained silent for several seconds before Ashworth spoke. "Your Grace," he said, addressing Revessa by the title that technically still belonged to her, despite everything Heldreth had arranged, "your analysis is the most comprehensive briefing I have received since this crisis began." Draven stared at the table in front of him. His hands were clasped together so tightly the knuckles had gone white. That evening, while the council members dispersed to their lodgings, Heldreth approached Revessa inside the corridor outside the Great Hall. The Dowager Duchess moved slowly, her face carrying an expression Revessa had never witnessed from her before. Uncertainty. "You were always capable," Heldreth said stiffly, as though the words physically resisted leaving her mouth. "I simply believed capability in a woman was a threat rather than a virtue." Revessa studied the woman who had dismantled her marriage, engineered her exile, and attempted to erase her from existence. It was a threat, Revessa replied quietly. Just not to the people you thought it threatened. She turned and walked away before Heldreth could respond, her boots echoing steadily against the stone floor while the Dowager Duchess stood alone in the corridor, diminished for the first time in 30 years. Later that night, Draven found Revessa standing on the castle ramparts overlooking the dark harbor, where Thornmere's vessels rested at anchor, their lanterns reflecting against black water. He approached slowly, stopping several feet away as though an invisible barrier prevented him from coming closer. Revessa. Her name and his voice sounded different now, smaller, uncertain. Stripped of the authority that had once made his words feel like commands she was required to accept, she did not turn toward him. I rehearsed what I wanted to say to you during the entire journey here, Draven said quietly. Every version sounded like an excuse. That is because every version was an excuse, Revessa answered without cruelty. There was no anger left in her voice. Anger requires believing someone still has the power to wound you. She had moved beyond that. Draven's breathing became uneven in the cold air. I allowed my mother to convince me you were insufficient. The truth is that I was terrified of a wife who was stronger than me. Removing you was easier than becoming worthy of you. The admission hung in the darkness between them like something fragile suspended above stone. Revessa finally turned and looked at him. For several long seconds she studied the face she had once loved, the face that had once looked at her with vulnerability beside a fireplace during an autumn that felt like another lifetime. I believe you, she said softly, and I forgive you. But I will never return to Gramer Hall as your wife. I am no longer the woman you sent away, Draven. And Thornmere is no longer a place of exile. It is my home. Draven closed his eyes. When he opened them again, moisture glistened against the reflected lantern light. He nodded once, then he walked away. The Battle of the Northern Channel lasted 2 days. Foreign raiding vessels, emboldened by months of successful attacks against undefended coastal villages, entered the northern shipping lanes in force on the morning of the 29th of November. 14 ships carrying over 600 armed fighters advanced through heavy fog toward the mainland coast, expecting the same minimal resistance they had encountered throughout the autumn. They did not expect Thornmere. Revessa's defense strategy, approved unanimously by the Crown's military council, had positioned her forces across 3 coordinated layers. Hadwin commanded the naval element from Thornmere's harbor, deploying fast coastal vessels crewed by fishermen who knew every rock, current, and hidden channel along the northern shore. Torben led ground forces positioned at key landing points identified in Revessa's analysis, using terrain advantages that mainland commanders had never recognized. Gavrin's Forge had produced caltrops, reinforced barricades, and signal beacons deployed across 12 miles of coastline. And Revessa herself coordinated the entire operation from the Thornmere fortifications command post, using a relay system of signal fires and fast messenger boats that Hadwin had designed based on naval communication methods he had developed during 20 years of active service. The raiders never reached the mainland. Hadwin's coastal vessels intercepted the enemy fleet inside the narrow channel approaches where their larger ships lost maneuverability against. Smaller, faster craft navigated by crews who had sailed those waters in every storm for years. Torben's ground forces repelled 2 attempted landings at secondary beaches with such disciplined coordination that the raiding commanders abandoned the southern approach entirely within hours. By dawn of the second day, 9 enemy vessels had been captured, 3 had fled northward, and 2 had run aground on rocks that every Thornmere fisherman could have identified blindfolded. Not a single raiding fighter set foot on kingdom soil. Thornmere suffered 11 wounded, no deaths. The victory resounded across the kingdom with a force that stunned the crown, parliament, and every noble family that had spent years pretending the forgotten island did not exist. Newspapers printed accounts of the battle within days, describing in breathless detail how a force of fishermen, exiled veterans, and tradespeople had achieved what the crown's own naval patrols had failed to accomplish in months of costly operations. Merchants who had lost goods to the raiders celebrated openly in harbor taverns, raising glasses to an island most of them could not have located on a map the previous week. Coastal village families who had spent months living in terror of the next attack wept with relief when word reached them that the northern channel had been secured. Inside Gramer Hall, the news arrived during breakfast. Coruscant read the newspaper account aloud in disbelief while Heldreth sat motionless at the table, her tea growing cold in its cup. Lysara excused herself before the reading finished, claiming a headache, though the pallor spreading across her face suggested something considerably more uncomfortable than physical pain. Draven listened to every word without moving. When Coruscant finished, he stood from the table, walked to his study, and closed the door. The servants heard nothing from inside that room for the remainder of the day. Colonel Ashworth's official report to the Crown described the Thornmere Defense Force as the most effective, disciplined, and strategically brilliant military operation he had witnessed in 26 years of service. He named Reveza Ashern specifically as the architect of the strategy and the commander whose leadership had prevented what could have been the most devastating attack on the northern coast in a generation. The Crown's response arrived at Thornmere 6 weeks later, carried by a royal courier aboard a naval vessel flying the King's standard. Reveza read the letter inside the command room while Hadwin Brinley, Gavrin Torben, and 24 Thornmere residents who had fought in the defense gathered around her. The room smelled of salt air and wood smoke, and the particular warmth that fills spaces occupied by people who trust each other completely. The letter bore the King's personal seal. By royal decree, the island of Thornmere was formally restored as a crown territory of strategic importance. Reveza Ashcairn was appointed governor of Thornmere with full administrative and military authority, a title that carried rank equivalent to the most powerful estate holders in the kingdom. Every person who had served in the defense was granted full pardon for any prior offense, restoration of military service records and pensions where applicable, and formal recognition as members of the Thornmere Coastal Guard, a newly established branch of the kingdom's defense forces. The forgotten had been remembered, the discarded had been honored. The people an entire kingdom had thrown away were now officially recognized as its finest defenders. Reveza set the letter down slowly. Around her, silence held for several seconds before a woman named Aveline, Mareth's granddaughter, who had commanded a signal beacon crew during the battle with the same sharp steadiness her grandmother carried while hauling water buckets, spoke from the back of the room. "You gave us this." Reveza shook her head gently, her eyes glistening. "No, you gave me this. I simply helped you remember what you already were." The room erupted, not in polished applause, not in the rehearsed admiration of noble feasting halls. Thornmere's people cheered with the raw, unrestrained emotion of human beings who had spent years believing they were worthless and had just been told by an entire kingdom that they mattered. Brinley stood beside the doorway, tears streaming openly down her face without any effort to conceal them. Hadwin, the man who had not smiled in 15 years, pressed his weathered hand against his eyes and turned toward the window, and Reveza Ashcairn, the woman who had once been sent to this island carrying a single trunk and the belief that her life was over, stood among the people who had become her family and understood for the first time that every moment of suffering had been shaping her toward exactly this: not rescue, not revenge, purpose. Years passed and the world rearranged itself around the truth that Greymore Hall had tried to bury. Thornmere flourished under Reveza's governance. The harbor expanded into one of the most important trading posts on the northern coast. Merchant vessels requested Thornmere anchorage months in advance. Families from the mainland began relocating to the island voluntarily, drawn by fair governance, honest labor, and a community built on the radical principle that every person carried worth regardless of where they came from or what they had been told they deserved. Reveza walked the village roads every morning as she always had. She remembered every name. She visited every sick child. She sat beside Mareth's grave once a month and placed wildflowers against the stone. Because the old woman who had once greeted her with suspicion in a water bucket had been the first person on the island to leave dried fish outside her door, and Reveza understood that small gestures of trust were the foundations upon which everything meaningful was built. On the mainland, old Cordell still told anyone who would listen about the young Duchess, who had nursed her grandchild through fever and saved 14 families from floodwater. When news of Thornmere's victory reached the Ashcairn tenant farms, Cordell wept openly in her kitchen and whispered to her family that she had always known Reveza was destined for something the great house could never contain. Greymore Hall itself declined with the steady inevitability of a house whose foundations had been hollowed out long before anyone noticed the walls beginning to lean. Lasara departed within a year of the battle, relocating to London after recognizing that Draven's diminished reputation and deteriorating finances no longer served her ambitions. She left behind unpaid dressmaker invoices and a household staff who celebrated her departure by opening wine they had been hiding inside the cellar. Pantry, Heldreth's health, failed gradually. The Dowager Duchess, who had once controlled every detail of the Ashcairn estate with absolute precision, spent her final years inside a single room, attended by servants who performed their duties without warmth because none had ever been shown to them. Corisande married poorly and quickly, desperate to escape the collapsing estate. The marriage produced loneliness indistinguishable from the kind she had helped inflict upon Revessa years earlier. Draven remained at Greymore. He managed the estate alone with diminishing competence, haunted by a quiet understanding that the person who had possessed every quality needed to sustain his household and his legacy had been standing beside him for 3 years while he looked past her toward a woman measuring curtains. One autumn afternoon, a letter arrived at Thornmere bearing the Ashcairn seal. Revessa read it inside her study, overlooking the harbor while rain tapped softly against the windows. The letter requested help. Brinley watched from the doorway as Revessa set the letter down and stared at the gray sea for a long time. Then Revessa instructed the kitchen to prepare additional rooms and asked Hadwin to arrange transport from the mainland. When Draven arrived at Thornmere 3 weeks later, he looked older than his years. He stood on the dock where Revessa had first stepped ashore, carrying nothing except a trunk and a broken heart, and he could not meet her eyes. Revessa received him in the same stone cottage where she had spent her first freezing nights on the island. She offered him tea, warm bread from the village bakery, and a chair beside the fire. She offered him kindness, because that was what she had always offered everyone, and no amount of cruelty had ever succeeded in burning it out of her. Because in the end, the greatest victory was never revenge. It was never the title, the harbor, or the kingdom's recognition. It was becoming someone whose strength grew from the same quiet grace the world had. Once dismissed as weakness, and Thornmere, the forgotten island where the kingdom sent people it wanted to disappear, became proof of something the powerful have always feared most, that the ones they discard might be the ones they needed all along.